Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, November 3rd. The Israeli military announced overnight that its forces had surrounded Gaza City, setting in motion what it calls the next phase of its war to destroy Hamas. This morning, Secretary of State Antony Blinken landed in Israel for urgent talks with his counterparts and Prime Minister Netanyahu. He'll urge the government to consider humanitarian pauses to allow more aid to get in and hostages and American citizens to get out of Gaza. This reflects a growing concern that the situation inside the enclave for the 2.3 million people who live there has become seriously degraded, if not completely untenable, in part because of the way Israel is conducting this war. He will also discuss the growing fears that the war will escalate, which was underscored by a blistering speech this morning by Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. So this week, again, a look at the Middle East crisis. And here to talk about it are three reporters that covered the story. Deborah Amos, formerly international correspondent with National Public Radio and now with Princeton University. Stephen Erlanger, diplomatic correspondent for Europe of the New York Times, and Gideon Rachman, chief foreign affairs commentator at the Financial Times. Gideon is stuck in London traffic and will join us in a few minutes. Steve, Deb, great to see you this morning. Thanks so much. Steve, let's start with you. You've been in Israel reporting from the ground about what is happening and sort of just bring us up to date about where we are today before we talk about the challenges that remain.
Well, where we are is in a charnel house with a lot of people dying right now in Gaza as Israel prosecutes its war of self-defense. And you have the American Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, in Tel Aviv before he goes to other parts of the region, urging the Israelis to be careful with humanitarian law, to be careful about civilian casualties, to protect their own interests in the region, which are wider than Gaza, and American interests in the region also. The Americans always have a clock running on all of these Gaza incursions. Usually it's the Americans who do the cold calculus of how many civilian dead to how much time to Israel's military ambitions. This time, given the horror of what happened October 7, when at least 1,200 Israeli civilians were murdered in Israel proper, not settlers, but Israeli citizens living in Israel, I think the clock will run longer. But there is a clock, and it is ticking. And then, as you mentioned, Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of Hezbollah, which basically controls southern Lebanon, which is also supported by Iran, as is Hamas, as is Islamic Jihad inside Gaza, gave a speech which actually, I think, was blistering, but also made it clear how hesitant he is to widen the war. And I think people will be relieved by that. But it is another factor in this ticking clock, because it is very important, I think, for everybody's sake, that the war not broaden further.
Deborah, Blinken sent back to the region. I think this week we just heard growing concerns from the White House about what is happening on the ground in Gaza. Still full support for Israel's right, an obligation, I think is the word they use, to defend itself, given the atrocities and horrific events of October 7. But a worry that the situation just is becoming untenable in the region. And this push now from the president and others for what's called a pause. How should we think about what they're actually calling for, given that neither the U.S. government nor, of course, Israel is in favor of a ceasefire, which is what a pause sort of seems to imply?
So think about the president's constituency. We already know that in the Democratic Congress, there's been a shift and there are more pro-Palestinian and pro-Israeli people in Congress on Biden's side. He has to keep that in mind. And let us not forget about the ticking time clock. Europe, you can see, is starting to move towards more criticism of the bombing. And if you saw, I guess, earlier this week, it is the chief prosecutor of the ICC stands at the border with Egypt to Gaza and says, halting humanitarian aid may be a war crime. So there are lots of calls. I see it in the newspapers every day for a ceasefire. I think that the language of a humanitarian pause is more palatable. Israel says if we have a ceasefire, it just gives Hamas a chance to rebuild. And so I think that is just not a saleable point with the Israeli leadership, but a pause might be, especially as you see international jurists say, this may be a war crime.
So, I mean, Steve, this issue of a pause, it helped me think through, how do you do pauses that are not ceasefires?
Well, you don't. I mean, frankly, a ceasefire is a ceasefire where everybody stops shooting for a period of time, presumably for a long time. A pause could be an hour. A pause could be 30 minutes. A pause could be to allow ambulances to get to a hospital. It could be to allow a convoy of trucks to get further into northern Gaza with aid and medicine, not fuel, because the Israelis won't allow that. Or it could be a pause, which there's already been one, frankly, to allow hostages to be released. Biden and Netanyahu agreed on such a pause from Israeli shelling and bombing to get 2 American citizens out. So that's the kind of thing the Americans and Israelis are talking about. And it's a very different thing from 2 sides agreeing to a ceasefire, which usually leads to negotiations and so on.
Yeah, and I guess that's and a pause doesn't necessarily have to be all-encompassing. It could be localized in some way to say, okay, no bombing of the South for the next 2 hours in order to let things to come in, and a lot is slightly more palatable. I did see, I think, confirm. I don't know if you saw this, Deborah, that Netanyahu just said he would do a ceasefire, but only if the hostages were out, which is actually interesting because that changes.
Yes, it does.
Objective. If the objective is now to get the hostages out, then we can have, rather than taking out Hamas, you wonder whether what is happening on the ground is the best way to get the hostages out. But how do you see this? This constant debate between the objective of getting Hamas versus the objective of getting the hostages out.
So I do see this debate. I see it particularly in the American press, where people are writing that, Israel could certainly stand to lose 250 people, hostages, if they can wipe out Hamas. And it just ignores so many facts. One, even Israeli intelligence has said you cannot get rid of Hamas. Hamas is a movement. And you can take out all of its leaders and you will still have Hamas. It's a bigger idea than simply killing all of its leaders. And 2, I think that the Israeli population, I just saw something on social media, which was all of the pictures of all of the hostages. It's a movement, speaking of movements. And I think it matters a lot to the Israeli public that you never leave hostages behind, even if it is a dead body that you are getting out. And that has been the history of this country's approach to any kind of hostage taking, which is why Hamas did it in the first place. I think perhaps for them, they didn't really expect to get 250. 3 would have been in the category of what they needed to do. But I think we have to watch and see how much this concern in Israel for these 250 people will change strategy. And I don't think we know that yet.
Gideon Rachman, chief correspondent foreign affairs correspondent for the Financial Times, has joined us. Gideon, great to see you. We have been just talking about just the latest news coming out of Gaza, including the speech from Nasrallah, as well as, of course, the visit of Tony Blinken, and the focus very much on humanitarian pauses in the situation. So your perspective on that, but also you wrote a very prescient column this week on, I think, what I still think is the number one concern in Washington, which is that this war is going to escalate, and that in fact the humanitarian situation in Gaza is if not the most important factor in whether that happens or not. What's your sense of the debate that's ongoing on this issue, and the worry and the ways it might be countered?
Yeah, hi Ivo. So, and apologies I'm late, so yes, I mean, I was very struck talking to you people in Washington, many of them your former colleagues, by how when they looked at it purely from a position of, well, what do we as America have to worry about, as opposed to all the other things to worry about, like the humanitarian issues and the security of Israel, all of which matter. But it's that they get sucked into another war in the Middle East, and there's a sense that this is kind of hair trigger stuff. There are various ways it could happen, but one of them, probably the central scenario, is that Hezbollah join the fight, that Israel attacks Lebanon, because Hezbollah could, force all Israelis basically to live in bomb shelters for a while. And then if Israel goes after Lebanon, does Iran come in more directly, perhaps through the IRGC, and then, all bets are off. And then there are variants of that. What if the various Iranian proxies that have been attacking American forces on a daily basis, since the outbreak of this conflict, actually inflict some major casualties, and then America feels obliged to respond? And those could be actors we hadn't even thought of really before this, like the Houthis, who are suddenly lobbing missiles in the direction of Israel. So yeah, I think they're extremely concerned about it. Given that, I mean, I think that Nasrallah's speech there, or I've only read brief accounts of it, is relatively reassuring. Could have been a hell of a lot worse. It sounds like he's saying somebody's got to do something, but my first preference is an Arab oil embargo, rather than, ramping up Hezbollah attacks. And so that is good, but obviously the situation's highly volatile, and there may come a point where the Iranians or Hezbollah feel that if they don't act, they lose this sort of cloak they have as the leaders of the axis of resistance. And, also Israel, I think probably they've got their hands full in Gaza, but, speaking to Israelis, they say, well, we now believe that we can't really let Hezbollah stay as it was. We can't tolerate these threats on our border. So, yeah, there's a lot that could go wrong.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what I'm hearing in Washington too. There's just too many things that are beyond the control of anyone. And Steve, you were in Israel reporting from there, and there was initially, and it continues to be a debate exactly on the point that Gideon says. Is this now so changed Israel's sense of its own security, the idea that there is an existential threat that it needs to take out those threats? And that's not just Hamas. In some ways, it's not at all Hamas, but it is Hezbollah. And if you really want to think about it, it's Iran. Long debate, the problem of Israel, and how live is the debate on the question of how Israel should deal with all of its enemies all at the same time?
There are lots of people talking about lots of things, and there's a lot of mad talk in lots of places. But right now, Israel's concentrating on one thing, which is defeating Hamas and yanking it out of power inside Gaza. It certainly has 2/3 of its forces in the north, just in case. It has at least more than half of its air force aimed at the north, just in case. So I think what you see with Nasrallah is a kind of mutual deterrence. I mean, he knows he could do a lot of harm to Israel. He has very, very good guided missiles that could reach all over Israel. But he also knows Israel could destroy southern Lebanon. And after 2006, he regretted having started a war with Israel. I think it's a big problem, and I don't think Iran wants to sacrifice Hezbollah for the Palestinians. Hezbollah doesn't exist to defend the Palestinians. It exists to deter Israel from attacking Iran. That's why it exists. So I think there are very big worries. Certainly, there are those in Israel who say, look, we let Hamas get strong, that the idea that we could contain it was wrong. The thought that we could push the Palestinian issue to the side, which the Americans helped them do, by the way, was wrong. So we should deal with Hezbollah because, after all, that's a big threat to us. But that's a very, very minor view right now. And I think they're going to have enough trouble where they are right now before they start thinking more ambitiously.
That's exactly right. I think the rational calculation leads you one way, and unfortunately the sort of the anger and grief and rage often leads you,
which is real.
And it's real. It's real in Israel. It's real as a result of Israel's response in much of the Arab world. And so, Deborah, I mean, sort of shifting over a little bit on this issue, which you started to raise earlier on the nature of Israel's campaign and what it is doing, not only inside Gaza, but what it means from an international legal perspective. On the one hand, on the other hand, given the kind of truly outrageous and horrific barbarism that we saw committed by Hamas, first of all, importantly, inside Israel, as Steve rightly said, against at least 1,200 civilians, not counting another 100 plus military Israelis who also were killed, but also a fighting a war by putting the most precious assets in the most vulnerable places: hospitals, schools, mosques, etc. And it raises real issues of international legal law and proportionality and how to fight a war against an enemy that uses people, frankly, as a human shield.
It sure does. And I think what we know, and certainly if we didn't, we would have learned it through the war between Russia and Ukraine, that there's no global 911 for war crimes. There's no squad that comes in and stops it. It takes a long time to prosecute war crimes. The law is complicated. There's a lot of theater involved. I think that's why you saw the head prosecutor of the ICC go stand on the border. He also did that in Ukraine. He stood in the capital. And so there are performative parts of this. But at the end of the day, it is a very rules-based situation. And there's facts that matter. Who was the aggressor? There's no doubt who the aggressor was. The aggressor was Hamas. And so almost everything they've done around October 7th is a war crime. Israel has the right to defend itself. The question is how Israel defends itself. If you look at all the statements coming out of the UN, they say it may be a war crime, it could be a war crime, because what you have to prove is intent. And that is a high bar. And you know, I've been following the Ukraine war crimes tribunals, the Syrian war crimes tribunals, and intent is always the hard part. Did Israel mean to kill civilians when they went after those targets in Jabalia refugee camp, or was it simply, you know, something that happened because the tunnels collapsed underneath? And it's almost impossible to investigate any of this until the war is over. You could do it in Ukraine because you can do open source in Ukraine. That's much harder to do in Gaza. Plus, because the Israelis are not a signatory to the ICC, they don't cooperate with any of their investigators. So maybe you could do some work in Gaza if it was safe to walk on the street. It is not. And when that happens, there will be open source investigations, is my guess, in Gaza. And we'll see what that means. But I think we have a way to go. And let me say one more thing about war crimes. I don't know of anybody who's ever been deterred when the UN says you might be committing a war crime. It's really rare because other factors are involved in those kind of military decisions. So some of this will have to wait till the war is over.
I think that just demonstrates the complicated nature of bringing a legal framework on particularly these kinds of conflicts that it underscores. But there is also a political reality, Gideon, in some ways that the legal issue matters perhaps less than how people on the street are experiencing what they're seeing on TV, which I wouldn't necessarily, or social media, or through reporting, which isn't the same as reality. Let me underscore that first of all. And clearly, there's a sense among a growing number of people in Europe. You had large demonstrations in London last weekend, for example, that Israel's gone too far. Quite apart from the underlying issue of oppression versus oppressors. Let's leave that apart, because I think that's a separate conversation about how we got to October 7, and not an irrelevant one, but that somehow that the way that Israel has responded, given the atrocities, just has gotten too far and has gotten out of hand. And you see governments and people really pressing. And I just wonder, Gideon, whether you see a sort of a shift. I mean, clearly October 8, 7, 8, 9, 10, there was one set of sentiments, and increasingly there's a very different side of sentiments, and how that is going to affect government policy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd describe it more as a polarization than a shift, in the sense that government policies actually haven't changed that much. You can see increasing unease in the kinds of things that the Americans are saying, and some of the Europeans, but nobody has said, actually we're withdrawing our consent for Israel doing what it has to do to take out Hamas. But I think what you can see is on the streets, which then reflects itself in politics, a mass movement against what Israel is doing in Gaza, which is, in which immigrant communities in Europe, particularly Muslims, play a big part, but by no means exclusively. It's kind of the left-wing cause now. And one of my concerns about what's happening in Europe is that Palestine will become the cause of the far left, and Israel will become the cause of the far right. You can already see that. The people like, oddly enough, given the anti-Semitic roots of the European far right, they're all in behind Israel at the moment. And then the middle is just kind of wringing its hands and saying, we don't know what to do. But on the question of legality, I mean, there is this sort of phrase, the law's an ass, that if it may, I'm not an international lawyer, maybe it was technically okay to drop a bomb on Jabalia to get a single Hamas commander and to kill 100 Palestinians, if that's how many died. But I think most people just feel, come on, that's sort of not justified morally, even if it is legally. That seems to be the feeling in Europe. But then again, where you start from, some people will totally withdraw consent, or will say, actually, this just proves what we've always known, that the Israelis are war criminals. Others will say, can we talk to the Israelis and tell them to stop doing this? But we remain, behind their broad effort, and we understand the difficulty of what they're trying to do. But yeah, I think it's a big problem in Europe, in European politics, and from what I read in American politics. It's interesting, just lastly, sitting here in the UK, where Keir Starmer's rise to becoming basically Britain's prospective next Labour Prime Minister involved him having to take control of his own party. And how did he purge the far left? By basically accusing them of anti-Semitism on the issue of Israel, and saying that and he'd kind of won that fight, and now it's completely reopened again because of what's happening.
Yeah, no, I think the Labour Party politics on this is sort of a microcosm of what we're seeing around the country. I should say, as I was talking last week with a very senior White House official who actually painted this as before, of course, the bombing of the refugee camp. We said, so let's assume that you have a Hamas fighter sitting on top of a hospital shooting rockets at Israel. Does that mean that does Israel have a right to go after that fighter? Of course he does. Does it mean you bomb the hospital in order to get him? Of course it doesn't. And sort of that was sort of their perspective. And I think the concern that you hear in Blinken's press conference yesterday, and the reason I think he's going there is to say, you guys got to figure out a different way to do this, because it really does have an impact, Deborah.
So I wanted to address what Gideon was talking about. You can see the administration shift in those daily White House call transcripts. They're not transcripts, but how they see the call. The ones with Egypt are the most interesting in my view. Every time they have a call, they say, and we say again and again that no Gazans will live in Egypt. We are not going to allow that. And we guarantee that all of those Palestinians who are coming out of Gaza, who are going to the field hospitals, will be able to go home. And that's interesting to me, because you can see public opinion both in Europe and the US saying, why won't the neighbors take these Palestinians? And if you have any sense of history, I always say 48, did that pass you by? Did you not get that part where Palestinians were transferred? And they're very sensitive about it. So are the Egyptians. And Jordan hasn't even come up in this. I'm sure they don't even think about it. You're not moving them here. So I do see the administration trying very hard to hit these points that they know how they play in, even here in the Arab communities, which Biden did very well with in the last election. And we'll see what happens this time.
Yeah, the electoral fallout of this for the president in places like Michigan is going to be very, very significant. I mean, Steve, let's turn sort of to Israel itself, because
to the Arab world. Let's do that too,
and the Arab world, because Tony Blinken is going to Jordan tomorrow. He was not able to do that, or the president was not able to do that because of the Ali Arab hospital bombing, and as we now know, a misfired rocket coming from Palestinian Islamic Jihad caused that explosion and the deaths that resulted from it. But let's focus start one on the issue of Israel. You've been reporting from there. You've been talking to Israeli communities. Of course, you were reported there when you were bureau chief a few decades ago. But some of the characters are the same characters, including the same prime minister. And there is this growing sense, I think, in the commentariat that this government just can't continue with the deep unpopularity within the country, and frankly, with all the mistakes that it has made and the divisions that we now have on whether to give the Palestinians funding and all that sort of stuff. So give us paint the picture of what you found inside Israel itself.
Well, the divisions obviously started 9 months ago when Netanyahu proposed with his far-right government in an effort to stay out of jail. He proposed these judicial changes that would politicize the judiciary and really cut the country in half politically. So you start with that, and then you have this extraordinary failure of security, intel, military on October 7th, which wasn't just a shock, it was a disaster. It was a calamitous failure. And so the government, Bibi Netanyahu, will be held responsible. At the moment, there's a unity government, which does not do any domestic legislation. So this judicial reform, so-called, is off the table. The government is there simply, basically, to do a budget and to prosecute the war. And it contains the most popular opposition figure, Benny Gantz, who's a former general, interestingly, Yair Lapid, who was another political rival, but not a general, decided to stay out of this unity government, hoping to pick up the pieces. So whenever the war ends, and of course it will end, there will be an accounting. There aren't elections scheduled, but it's very possible that Likud will pull Netanyahu down. I think most high-ranking military and intel people will resign after the war to take responsibility. And the hope that the Americans have, of course, is that a new Israeli government is more prepared to deal seriously with a political discussion about what to do with Palestinian statehood, Palestinian Authority, and who's going to run Gaza afterwards. I mean, there are different options. We can talk about that if you like. But in the Arab world, I just would say very, very quickly, the street protests have had a very big impact on governments that really hate Hamas. They hate radical Islam. They hate the Muslim Brotherhood. They fear Iran, which is the sponsor of Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad. So they're in a particularly awkward place. And al-Sisi in Egypt, who spent a lot of money very brutally crushing radical Islam in the Sinai, has no interest in importing Hamas, let alone Gazans, for the reasons Deborah mentioned, because it would seem like another Nakba. And Jordan, too, which has plenty of Palestinian refugees. I mean, Gaza's an orphan. Nobody cares about Gaza. Nobody wants it. Anwar Sadat didn't want it back. So the big question is, who will take care of Gaza after the war? I mean, you know, we're not there yet, but people are talking about it. It's a crucial issue because it can't go on this way. It's unfair to the people of Gaza, either to live with this horrible Hamas dictatorship, which they take all the money and put it underground. I mean, Abu Marzouk gave an interview on Arabic television in which he was asked about the people of Gaza. He said, that's not our concern. We're Hamas. We're concerned about ourselves. These people are the care of Israel and the UN. We don't care about them. That's what he said. So there has to be some better solution, and there has to be a promise that Israelis can live inside Israel proper in peace. And that's the American challenge. That's the real international challenge to come. And I think you'll get a lot of help from Sunni Arab states to do that.
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right. And there's two pieces I want to pick up, and Gideon and Deborah think about whichever you want to take. But one is the question: if you have a government that is both unpopular and that knows that when the war is over, they're gone, how does that affect the conduct of the war? And to what extent is the conduct of the war influenced by sort of agreed national objectives versus the survival of the government, or at least the survival, in this case, of the prime minister? And I think it's a question that reading at least the opposition press in Israel is uppermost in people's mind. And then, of course, secondly, this fundamental challenge that the U.S., I think rightly, as Steve said it, has: how do you mobilize an Arab world to take actions that up till now it's never been willing to take? So that is some responsibility, financial and in many ways in a security sense, for helping the Palestinians become viable, to helping the Palestinians to be viable as an entity and as a governing entity, financially and with military support. That's the conundrum, it seems to me, that we have. Gideon.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you raise about what exactly are Netanyahu's incentives now is an important one. I mean, you know, if you were being bleak about it, you could say he doesn't want this war to end, because the moment the war ends, there's a reckoning, and he falls, and he may feel, well, if he can carry Israel to victory, he can yet emerge. He's a great survivor, after all, as, you know, a war hero or something, you know, at least somebody who's redeemed his reputation. But I think the bigger regional issue is really interesting. And I was in Riyadh last week for this big investment conference they have, and talking to the Saudi high-ups, as opposed to, you know, ordinary people, I didn't get the feeling that they were in great emotional turmoil about what was going on in Gaza. These are, if I can put it this way, quite cold people. And they still have a very strategic sense of what they want. They have their Vision 2030, the modernization of Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia becoming a big global player. So the last thing, they really don't want a regional war. But I think they also, if they can, want normalization with Israel still, despite all this. Mm-hmm. And that's where you could maybe come up with a kind of optimistic scenario, which is that if, you know, one scenario for Israel is it just goes crazy and goes off to the far right, and that's it, you know, but there's another possibility that, you know, the Likud fall and you have the center right come in, and there is some appetite for trying to look at the Palestinian issue as a political issue that needs to be solved. Yeah. And then I think the Saudi normalization piece and the Gulf normalization piece could be important, because they, you know, as one Israeli put it to me, that the only way this can be solved now is by broadening it into a broader regional issue, getting the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs involved. They can provide the money. They can also provide the route back for Israel into something like some kind of acceptance in its region, but in return, Israel would really have to make big concessions on the Palestinian issue that do take account of absolutely legitimate Israeli security concerns, but that are bigger than anything. You know, Netanyahu was kind of laughing up his sleeve before, when everyone was touting imminent Saudi-Israeli normalization, saying, oh, you know, it's just a box that needs to be ticked. I don't think he's going to get away with that, or his successor will get away with that anymore. If there's any way you're going to solve it, you're going to have to come up with some real solution. I don't think anyone yet has an answer to the question, though, that Steve posed, which is who runs Gaza? And that's
Right.
hugely important. And I don't think anybody's got a plausible answer yet.
Yeah, I think they have answers, but they know that those aren't the answers. In international force, well, you know, etc. I mean, we can come up with lots of models. Deborah, you've of course reported from the Gulf, and for many years, you know the place extraordinarily well, including the Saudis. I hear the same that Gideon had from American officials, that the Saudis remain interested in some normalization. But how do you get from here to there is really, I guess, the real question.
Well, that takes some mind turning, because you know, the best deal to sort this all out was on the table on October 6th, when the Saudi deal was on its way. It looked like they felt that if you just give the Palestinians enough money, we could sort all this out. The problem with that deal, and the problem with the one that people are talking about now, is it doesn't take into consideration that everything you thought before has failed. You cannot keep mowing the lawn in Gaza. That if you don't have a political platform, this is not going to work. You cannot ignore Palestinian aspirations. They build up and this kind of thing happens. So until I start hearing that, I will think, oh, you people do not have a clue about what you're going to do next. The Palestinian Authority in Gaza, I doubt it. I mean, what is in it for them? They are extremely weak, very unpopular. And whatever rump is left of Hamas, they will be the targets. So good luck in finding, if you're still thinking like this, that mowing the grass is the option, and not engaging in some political process. You're not going to get anybody who's going to want to run Gaza, not even the Qataris, who, you know, their position is we just dump the money. There have been Arabs who have been involved in Gaza, and Qatar is one of them, and they've done an interesting job. They've been a great negotiator for hostages. They've played a role, but governing, that's completely different.
Well, and they've been a great partner for the Israeli government in maintaining Hamas in power, because the Israeli government didn't want the PA, God forbid, with the power. You know, Steve, I think it was Blinken who testified on before the Senate and talked about sort of a four-phased plan that we've been talking about here, sort of a military action to topple Hamas, building up a credible Palestinian. So phase 2 is building up a credible Palestinian leadership. Phase 3 is Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation and some form of two-state solution, or whatever you want to call it. And phase 4 is Arab-Israeli and regional reconciliation. And the problem is, as they recognize, the Palestinians are too weak and the Israelis aren't willing to play ball. And so how do you solve that problem? I guess that's what Tony is doing in the Secretary of State is now doing in the region.
It's certainly, you raise all the right questions. The problem, as you know, is Israel has taken a lesson from Gaza, which is you don't give up control and let Palestinians run things on their own, because look what happens. Failing to remember they failed to negotiate the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005 with the Palestinian Authority. They just threw the keys into the street, right? And I believe what's most likely to happen, unlike Tony Blinken's lovely idea, which inshallah happens, is that Israel takes a bigger buffer zone inside Gaza. It builds a real wall, and it makes sure that border is impenetrable as much as it can. It cuts ties to Gaza. It says to the world, you feed them, you provide electricity, you provide water, we're done with it. And whenever we hear something serious aimed against us, we're going to go back in. Now, that's what I fear is going to happen. It'll be southern Lebanon again, sort of northern Israel, southern Lebanon. But my hope is that this is such a shock to the Israeli system, let alone to everyone else, that there is a serious effort to build, almost like Kosovo, a kind of international caretaker for Gaza, at least for a while, with peacekeepers that could be NATO country peacekeepers. They're not going to be Arab country peacekeepers. They're not going to peacekeep Palestinians, that's for sure. But, UNSO, which is a UN truce supervisory organization, still has a legal mandate to work in Gaza. It stopped doing that after Oslo Accords in '96. But one can imagine a different kind of mandate. So again, it takes a lot of imagination. The world hasn't shown much imagination, I have to say. But I really do think the Americans are the only ones the Israelis trust will have to lead if anyone's going to lead. If anything's going to happen, the Americans are going to have to lead it. Who will follow? I have no idea.
I think there's a lot of internal work being done in the State Department and Defense on those issues. They recognize a protectorate of some form is the only way out of this this madness. I agree with you that the Israelis will build a bigger wall. I think one of the lessons I hope they have learned that walls just don't protect you very well in an era of missiles, cyber warfare, and drone warfare. And I don't know how big and how tall you want to make that wall, but and how deep, by the way, but walls are not impenetrable in the modern world. It's not, we don't live in the Middle Ages anymore.
Big, beautiful wall, even.
Yeah, I mean, big, and have the Mexicans pay for it. Yes, we've been there.
Nobody's thought of that. Maybe the Mexicans can pay for it.
Gideon, how do you see it? You see the same bleakness in terms of getting out of this thing, or do you see silver rays of hope?
No, I mean, I think bleak's been the best bet for some years now, unfortunately. But I think what Steve described is certainly, he's been there for longer than I have, but certainly my understanding of why the Israelis are likely to head. I mean, I'm interested. It then throws a huge burden on both Egypt and the United Nations, because if there's only one working border into Gaza, the spotlight comes onto Egypt. Are they prepared to? What kind of relationship would they have with Gaza and things coming in and out and so on? And also the United Nations. I mean, as far as I can tell, the Israelis have skilled scores of UN workers in Gaza. Are they going to really say, oh, yeah, fine, we'll put some more people in and they can all be killed again next time? I mean, it's quite an ask.
Yeah, and I just speaking about the border, there's a sea. Which is also accessible and very hard to, I don't know if they're planning to build a wall to cut Gaza off the sea, but that one's hard too. So it's just usually these issues don't get resolved. And Deborah, I'm going to give you the last word. They don't get resolved by separation only. They have a political process that makes the separation viable.
So the thing that I notice and I look for are those groups still in Israel that are Palestinian Israelis and Jewish Israelis who still meet together, and that exists. And that makes me feel better when I see it. I don't know how big it is. I don't know how much it matters, but that it's possible is what's important. I thought that all the reporting of the Gazan workers who were near Kiryat Shimona in the south, they knew those Israelis. They did things like protect them. They were hiding in the orchards, and the Israelis came and got them. I mean, people knew each other, and so these were individual rejections of what Hamas was doing. So I think that there's still humanity to build on. If this war goes on for weeks and weeks, it gets tougher and tougher to have those meetings, because you can't help but take a side if your family gets blown up or yours has hostages in the tunnels. So I still look for those tweets, and it makes me feel a little better every day when I see them.
Well, I think that's where we should end, because we should have faith in humanity, that somehow at some point the forces of righteousness, in this case in the hearts of people, can find a way to reconcile. This is not the only conflict in the world where reconciliation looked bleak, but somehow happened. I'm old enough. No, I'm not actually. But I do remember my history that the French and the Germans didn't really like us. I grew up in Holland. We didn't like the Germans very much either, but now we're the best of friends. And so it is possible. And with that, I just want to thank Deborah Amos, Steve Erlanger, Gideon Rachman for another really fantastic conversation. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This has been an edition of World Review. We'll be back. Actually, we will not. Let me just underscore that. We will take a break. It's Veterans Day on next Friday. And so we will take a break, but we'll be back in 2 weeks with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.